Okay, so in this section we talk about measures of how spread out our data is, or sometimes called measures of variation. So let's compare two sets of data here. Set A consists of the five values 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And let's let set B be the set 1, 3, 7, 12, 12. Turns out if we took time to compute them, and we can actually do the first one really easily, the median, the middle of each data set, is exactly the same. All right, there's only five values, so 5 plus 1 would be 6 divided by 2. The third number is the median. And these are in order. So both these data sets have the median, a median of 7. And it turns out if we compute the mean, add each data value up and divide by 5, we will also get 7. So both these two sets of data have the same middle, all right, same median and the same mean. Now there is a difference, of course. The second set actually has a mode. The first set doesn't. And of course they do have different mid-ranges. But otherwise, those two sets of data are basically the same. Right? They're basically the same. Right? Those two sets of data are basically the same. Okay? They're basically the same data value, set of data. But they're different. Or this, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say they're the same. I'm sorry, I might just stop working for a second. They're not the same, of course, but they have the same middles. But they are very different. They're very different. So just looking at the middle uh, doesn't always give you an idea of uh, what's going on with the data. So that's why we talk about how spread out our data is. And the first measure of spread that we talk about is something called the range. Please do not confuse this with the mid-range. Okay? The range is a measure of spread, and it's the highest value minus the lowest value. Highest minus lowest. Okay? Whereas the mid-range is the average of the highest and lowest. You add them up and divide by 2. So very different here. We're subtracting them here, finding out what's the difference between the two. So in our first set over here, the range would be 9 minus 5 would be equal to 4. Whereas in our second set, the range would be 12 minus 1 would be 11. And so what the range is saying here is that the second set of data is about almost 3 times as spread out as the first set of data. The first set of data is much more compact than the second set. Okay. However, range is a very basic average. Okay, you saw this with the mid-range, right? It was only using 2 of the values in our set of data. And so therefore it's a very rough measure. It's a very rough measure. So very important idea about range. Range is not always a good measure of spread. It's not always a good measure of spread. Let's consider an example here. to show you how range isn't always a great measure. Let's say we're looking at two test scores. Let's say we were looking at scores that Becky had and that Tim had. Becky scored on their test 55, 65, 75, 85, and 90. There's a good bit of variation on Becky's test scores. Tim, on the other hand, scored the following scores on his exams: 84, 87, 82, 41, and 90. Now, looking at these two groups and thinking about how spread out the data is, when we look at Tim's, we see that for the most part he's pretty consistent, except for that one kind of out there test score. The rest of his scores are pretty consistent, whereas Becky has much more variation in her test. Yet if we look at the range, Becky would have 90 minus 55, give her a range of 35. Give Becky a range of 35. So on her test, her range was 35. Tim, on the other hand, if we compute his range, would be 90 minus 41. And so his scores cover a bigger range. Even though if you look at each value individually, it looks like his values are a lot more consistent, except for that one really bad value, whereas Becky's are overall more spread out by comparison. Huh? So that measure there that we've looked at here isn't always a good predictor of how all the data is doing. The range is only a predictor of how far is it between the highest and lowest. And so for that reason, it's not really a great measure of spread. It's more like a ballpark type thing. Okay, more like a ballpark indicator of what's going on with your data.